They say we should fear humanity. Vieiroc's voice was like a blade scraping against steel, cutting through the suffocating tension in the Grand Senate chamber. Thousands of alien delegates fell silent, their scaled, chitinous, or fur-covered faces turning toward the lone warlord who dared to stand. His crimson battle-scarred armor gleamed under the dim light, and his eyes, burning embers from a world where only the strongest survived, locked onto the cowards before him. I say you are all fools. Fear? No. It is already too late for that. Humanity is not something you fear, it is something you survive, if you're lucky. They say we should fear humanity. Vieiroc's voice thundered across the Galactic Senate chamber, its massive domed ceiling amplifying every syllable. Thousands of alien delegates, draped in regal silks, armored plates, and bioengineered exoskeletons, fell into an uneasy silence. He stood alone. Towering. Unyielding. A predator among cowards. Fear? He growled. No. It is already too late for that. The holoscreens flickered to life, displaying the classified footage none of these spineless diplomats wanted to acknowledge. It played in eerie silence, human warships slipping through defenses like ghosts, elite strike teams outmaneuvering entire armadas, colonies rebuilding overnight from what should have been annihilation. The chamber trembled with barely restrained panic. This is an anomaly, croaked a Zalrun delegate, his gelatinous form shifting in discomfort. They are short-lived. Weak. They should not be capable of such feats. Yet they are. Vieirac cut him off, his crimson eyes locking onto the trembling official. And you still do not understand why. A warlord of the Vaktra war clans slammed a fist onto his podium, his claws cracking the obsidian surface. Enough of this fear-mongering. We have ruled this galaxy for thousands of years. What is a species that has barely crawled out of its own system compared to us? Vieirac turned, stepping forward with deliberate, crushing force. I led the invasion of Epsilon Ares III, he said. The room froze. Ah, the Varesh Ascendancy representative scoffed. So we finally hear it from the great warlord Vieirac himself. Your fleet vanished without a trace. We assumed. You assumed we won. Vieirac interrupted. Because the alternative was impossible, wasn't it? The screens shifted again. This time, they saw what he saw. Flaming wreckage. The skeletal remains of a fleet once thought invincible. Armored corpses, Erdakkai warriors, his warriors, scattered across the wasteland, their weapons pried from cold, dead hands. Not a single human body among them. We came with fire and wrath, he continued, his voice an ironclad whisper. And they were waiting for us. A senator from the Trell Dominion chittered in disbelief. Preposterous! You are Erdakkai, a race born of endless war. How could humans? Do not mistake savagery for weakness, Vieirac snapped. We landed under cover of darkness, believing ourselves unseen. We were wrong. They watched us from the shadows, already adapting, already planning. Before our boots touched their soil, they had learned us. The images shifted again. Alien weapons, Erdakkai rifles, Varesh energy swords, Zalrun bioweapons, all in human hands. They do not just fight, Vieirac continued, his voice razor-sharp. They steal. They learn. They become stronger. A ripple of unease spread through the chamber. And you still believe you can conquer them? He let out a sharp, humorless laugh. They turned our own weapons against us. Our strategies. Our tactics. By the time we realized, they had encircled us. Impossible, hissed the delegate. Vieirac's next words silenced him. They had already won before we fired a single shot. The Senate floor erupted into chaos. This cannot be. They must have had outside assistance. Their technology is primitive. A fluke. Vieirac simply watched. Even now, they refused to see it. Then, he dropped the final blow. The last transmission from my second-in-command, he said, and with a flick of his gauntlet, the screen changed again. The room shook as a voice filled the air, hoarse, ragged, terrified. We were wrong. Crackling static. The sound of something wet hitting the ground. The sharp gasp of a soldier who knew he was about to die. It's not just that they won't surrender. A low, guttural growl, a distinctly human sound, echoed in the background. It's that they don't know how. A wet snap. The transmission cut. Silence. Pure, absolute silence. Vierock let it linger. Let them feel it. Then he spoke. You sit here debating humanity's fate. He shook his head. That is laughable. The holoscreens flickered off. You don't decide humanity's future. He leaned forward, his voice dark, venomous. You're just hoping they leave you one. You still don't understand. Vierock's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with tension as every senator stared at him, their disbelief barely masking the fear in their eyes. You debate strategies, containment, annihilation, but none of you are asking the only question that matters. He let the words settle, his glare sweeping across the chamber. What if you've already lost? The murmurs returned, hushed whispers between delegates, some desperate to refute his words, others hesitant, as if realization was finally creeping in. The Trell senator, a wiry creature covered in glistening carapace, hissed. Preposterous. Humanity is nothing more than an anomaly. A violent breed that got lucky. Vierock's eyes burned. Lucky? He let out a slow, deliberate breath, the kind that made lesser beings reconsider their next words. I have fought in more wars than you have years of existence. I have crushed species beneath my boot before their suns had time to set. And never, never, have I seen luck shape the battlefield like this. A flick of his gauntlet, and the holoscreen changed again. Look closely. More footage. But this time, there were no great warships, no fleets in orbit, no grand battles. Instead, the grainy recording showed something else entirely. A ruined city, its skyline blackened, its streets in rubble. Smoke curled into the sky like the breath of a dying beast. And yet, movement. Not civilians fleeing. Not soldiers regrouping. But humans. Building. Stone by stone, steel by steel. This, Vierock said, voice low, controlled, dangerous, was a human colony that the Zalrun bombed to dust. Wiped from the records. Total annihilation. He paused. And yet, 3 weeks later, their city stood again. The Zalrun senator paled, his gelatinous form quivering. They do not wait for rescue. Vierock continued. They do not beg. They do not kneel. They rebuild. They adapt. And they remember. The Varesh delegate clicked her mandibles in frustration. They are still fragile. Break their infrastructure, cut their supply chains, isolate their planets. They will starve. They will fall. A sharp, humorless laugh left Vierock's lips. Starve? He tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with something bordering on amusement. Have you ever seen a human fight with nothing left? Have you seen them dig through the dirt with their bare hands just to find something to sharpen into a blade? He stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the chamber. Your mistake, he growled, is believing that if you burn everything they have, they will break. His lips curled. You are wrong. He turned back to the holoscreen, playing the last piece of evidence. This is what happened to my warriors. The screen shifted. A battlefield, littered with bodies, but no grand victory. No banners waving over conquered land. Just the silence of the dead. 30 of my best, Vierock murmured. Hardened killers. Death incarnate. They moved in silence. They struck with precision. They had the advantage. A figure appeared on the screen. Human. Small. Underfed. Wounded. He should have been dead. Instead, he held the weapon of an Urdakai warrior. Bloodied. Rewired. And he was smiling. The room went cold. They don't fight wars, Vierock said. They become them. The recording flickered and cut to static. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the Zalrun senator shattered the silence, voice shaking. Then we must act now. Strike first. Deploy bioweapons. Vierock turned on him so fast that the air itself seemed to tremble. You think you're the first to try? The senator recoiled. Vierock's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. They survive plagues. They adapt to radiation. They fight through starvation, through disease, through suffering so profound that even the Urdak Kai would falter. His eyes narrowed. Do you know what happened to the last species that tried to exterminate them with a virus? No one answered. Neither do we. Silence. His words hit like a blade to the throat. The chamber was suffocating now. They are not special. One senator muttered, voice hoarse, as if trying to convince himself. They are not gods. Vierock laughed. No, he said. They are worse. His gaze swept the room, watching the cracks in their pride, the fear settling into their bones. You think you still have control, he said. You don't. They are already inside your networks, your borders, your systems. They know your plans before you do. You assume this is still a debate. He leaned forward, slow and deliberate, his voice dropping to something lethal. You assume you have a choice. The room erupted into chaos. Screams. Panic. Frantic voices yelling for war councils, for emergency fleets, for preemptive strikes. It was pathetic. Vierock watched as the Senate shattered before his eyes, empires unraveling, alliances crumbling under the weight of fear. And he smiled. Because humanity hadn't won the war. They had never needed to fight it. You think you can still control this? Vierock's voice was calm now, quiet, but it carried across the chamber like the final toll of a war drum. The chaos around him was deafening, senators barking commands into communication relays, emergency codes being broadcast, entire factions crumbling under the weight of their own panic. They were too late. The Zalrun delegate's voice shook. Deploy the fleets. We strike before they. They already know. Vierock interrupted. You don't think they anticipated this? He let out a slow breath, his lips curling in something that wasn't quite a smile. You believe in fleets. In ships. In walls. Humanity believes in getting inside. A chime echoed through the chamber. Then another. Dozens, hundreds. Every senator with a data pad, a communicator, a secured uplink, all flashing with alerts at once. The Zalrun delegate grabbed his device, tentacles shaking as he read. His blackened eyes went wide. No. No, this is a bluff. Vierock turned his head slightly. Is it? The Trell senator clutched at his chest, spines flaring. Our encryption. Our war logs. These are live feeds. His breathing hitched. They've breached every network. The chamber pulsed with terrified realization. Holoscreens flickered, displaying live data streams, military command centers locking down, dreadnoughts disabling their own engines, orbital defense systems shutting off one by one. The humans weren't just fighting a war. They had already ended it. A single voice cut through the noise. Low. Calm. Human. This is Admiral Castor of the Terran United Front. The chamber went still. Your weapons are offline. Your fleets are blind. Your defenses are ours. This is not a declaration of war. The silence stretched, suffocating. This is a courtesy. The transmission cut. For a moment, there was nothing. No yelling, no scrambling, just a slow, creeping terror settling into the bones of every being in the room. Then the Varesh delegate slammed her fist onto the podium. This is an illusion. A deception. Humans are parasites. They steal, they mimic, but they are not superior. Her eyes burned as she turned on Vierock. You knew. You knew this would happen, and you did nothing. Vierock chuckled, a deep, guttural sound. Nothing? He stepped forward. I warned you. I told you. I showed you. His crimson eyes flicked across the chamber. You didn't listen. They won't rule us. The Varesh delegate's mandibles clicked furiously. We can still. Still what? Vierock asked, voice almost amused. Fight? With what? She hesitated. You think they're interested in ruling you? Vieirac shook his head. They don't want your empire. They don't want your systems, your territories, your thrones. His voice turned sharper. They want your silence. The chamber dimmed. Another broadcast cut through, this time in multiple alien dialects. No human faces. Just a simple message. Do not resist. There will be no negotiation. The last desperate threads of defiance snapped. Delegates collapsed into their seats, others backing away from their podiums, as if even standing in defiance might draw attention. The Senate, once the unshakable center of the galaxy, was crumbling. The Trell senator finally spoke, voice hollow. Then what happens now? Vieirac exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Now? He gave a slow, deliberate glance around the room. Now you decide if you want to be useful. A flicker of hope from the few still desperate to survive. They don't erase species that can be useful. Vieirac continued. They integrate them. Take what they need. Repurpose. His lips curled. But for those who fight? No one spoke. They didn't have to. The message was clear. The weak would kneel. The stubborn would vanish. And humanity would move forward. Another chime. Another alert. The Senate's own central network had been breached. Permanently. The Zalrun senator swallowed hard. We surrender. Vieirac smiled. Of course you do. And just like that, the war was over before it had even begun. You don't understand what's coming. Vieirac's voice was calm, almost amused, as he surveyed the broken Senate. The mighty ruling body of the galaxy, once so certain in its dominion, now silent, its leaders reduced to frightened prey. The last vestiges of their arrogance had crumbled beneath the weight of inevitability. You surrender, he said, tilting his head. Of course you do. It's the only choice you have left. The Zalrun delegate wiped his trembling appendages against his robe, as if trying to rid himself of the stench of failure. If we comply, he rasped, what assurances do we have? Vieirac let out a slow, knowing breath. Assurances? He chuckled, dark and hollow. You think you are in a position to negotiate? His gaze swept the room, lingering on each delegate long enough to let the truth sink in. Do you still believe this is a conversation? The Trell senator finally raised his head. There must be terms. Some way to. To what? Vieirac interrupted, his tone dripping with amusement. Survive? Silence. He nodded, as if speaking to children. Then you need to understand something. You are not surrendering. You are being allowed to exist. The room shifted, the weight of those words pressing down on those who had once believed themselves untouchable. The Varesh delegates' mandibles quivered. They could have eradicated us already. If that was their goal, they would have done it. They could have. Vieirac agreed, watching the ripple of realization in the room. And yet they haven't. A calculated pause. Then he leaned forward. And you should be very afraid of why. The holoscreens flickered again, but this time, there were no battlefields, no fleets, no captured systems. Instead, the display showed factories. Human factories. Do you know what this is? Vieirac's voice was almost gentle. This is what they built when they learned war was no longer necessary. The footage showed machines, thousands of them, not forging weapons, but entire ecosystems. Terraforming engines larger than cities, rebuilding dying planets in days, not centuries. The Senate stared, mesmerized, horrified. They don't need to conquer planets. Vieirac continued. They can make their own. They don't need to fight for resources. They create them. His lips curled. And now you must ask yourselves, what do they need you for? The Trell senator exhaled, his spines rattling. They're not after our territory. No. They don't want our fleets. No. The room seemed to shrink as Vieirac's voice dropped lower. Then why did they let us live? A single, suffocating pause. The answer was worse than war. The Zalrun delegate's voice barely held together. We're being evaluated. Vieirac's smile was razor sharp. Yes. They could have crushed us. The words were barely above a whisper. They could have taken everything. But they didn't. They're watching, Vierock confirmed. Studying. Calculating. His crimson eyes flickered. Waiting to see if you have anything left to offer. The chambers shuddered under the weight of that truth. And if we don't? Vierock's fingers tapped the metal podium, slow and deliberate. Then, Senator, he murmured, you'll simply disappear. The implications were worse than extermination. The Senate had imagined a war, a fight for survival, a desperate stand against a rising power. But that was never the game. They were not enemies. They were irrelevant. The Trell Senator's claws curled against the surface of his station. Then we must prove our worth. Vierock laughed. Oh, now you understand. He took a slow step forward, towering over the chamber. And that is why I am here. His voice grew darker, heavier, absolute. To tell you that your reign is over. To tell you that your false empires have no meaning anymore. But he let the silence stretch, pulling them further into the abyss. You still have a choice. The Zaurun delegate's breath hitched. A choice? Vierock nodded. You can kneel, he said simply. Or, he tilted his head, voice soft. You can vanish. The chamber collapsed into silence. And just like that, the Senate ceased to exist. You misunderstand what kneeling means. Vierock let the words settle, watching the remnants of the Galactic Senate grasp for an argument they no longer had. The great empires that had ruled for millennia now stood on the precipice of irrelevance, their thrones shattered, their fleets useless, their power undone. The Zaurun delegate swallowed hard, voice unsteady. We accept human dominance. We will cooperate. Vierock exhaled through his nose, amused. Cooperate? He rolled the word in his mouth like an old, dying joke. Cooperation implies you have something to offer. What exactly do you think humanity needs from you? Silence. His voice dropped lower, an edge of something almost like pity beneath the iron. You thought surrender would mean servitude. Tribute. The chance to retain some fraction of control. He let the moment stretch. It does not. The Varesh delegate's mandibles clicked together, the sharp sound betraying her rising panic. Then what? What do they want? Vierock gave a slow, deliberate nod. The same thing you wanted from all the species you crushed beneath your boots. The words struck like a blade. You built an empire on the backs of lesser worlds. Vierock continued, stepping forward. Ripped their cultures apart, stripped them of their identities, and rewrote history with yourselves as the apex. His eyes burned as he swept his gaze across them. Did you think they weren't watching? The Trell Senator's claws trembled against the metal podium. This is different. They aren't like us. Vierock bared his teeth in something that might have been a smile. No, he admitted. They're worse. The chamber felt smaller. They do not conquer, Vierock murmured. They replace. A chime echoed through the chamber, soft, calm, merciless. The senators flinched, already knowing it was another human broadcast. No voices. No threats. Just a map. A map of the galaxy. And on it, in place of the Senate's territories, new names were written. Human names. Vierock turned back to them, voice quiet. They've already begun. The Zaurun delegate's throat tightened. But we haven't fought. Vierock's lips curled. You think they need a war? The screen shifted, flashing rapid images. Human ships in orbit over Senate-controlled worlds, infrastructure shifting overnight, industries redirected, entire economies absorbed without a single battle fought. It had never been a war. It had been an acquisition. They let you believe this debate still mattered, Vierock said. But the moment they broke your networks, the moment they disabled your fleets, the moment your own people started defecting. He spread his hands. It was over. The Trell senator's voice was barely above a whisper. What happens to us? Vierock tilted his head, as if considering. That depends. He let his gaze linger on each of them, letting the weight of his words take root. The ones who resist will be forgotten, he said simply. Wiped from history, erased from maps. Your languages will fade. Your legacies will turn to dust. A pause. But those who are useful? Those who adapt? He let the implication hang. Hope. It was the cruelest gift he could offer. The chamber shuddered under the weight of that choice. The Varesh delegate's voice was tight, controlled. And what about you, warlord? Vierak let the smallest smirk tug at the corner of his lips. What about me? You speak as if you are not one of us. His gaze darkened, amusement flickering behind something older, something deeper. I never was. The realization settled across the room. Vierak had seen what they refused to acknowledge. He had accepted what they still fought against. He had already chosen his side. You're with them, the Zalrun delegate breathed. Vierak gave a slow nod. I am. The words crashed through the chamber like an executioner's axe. The mighty warlord of the Urdak Kai, the last empire to ever challenge the Senate's rule, had knelt first. And with that, the final pillar of their old world collapsed. For the first time in recorded history, the Galactic Senate fell. And humanity rose.